London, 1858. A mother walks through the market, her basket empty, her heart full of purpose. She will feed her family well today. The stalls are piled high with jewel-bright sweets, crusty white loaves, jugs of milk thick as cream, meat glistening red and fresh. She chooses carefully, stretching every penny, selecting the most beautiful items she can afford. The green candy for her daughter, the whitest bread, the creamiest milk, the reddest meat. She doesn't know that the candy contains arsenic. The bread is stretched with plaster and ground bones. The milk is sewage water thickened with chalk. The meat is rotting flesh painted with lead. There are no labels, no regulations, no safety testing. Every item in her basket is a poison dressed as food. She walks home satisfied, planning meals to nourish the ones she loves. What she's actually carrying is a collection of killers that will slowly destroy her family from the inside. The Victorian ideal placed motherhood at the very center of domestic life. The Victorian ideal placed motherhood at the very center of domestic life. A woman's sacred duty was to create a haven of purity and nourishment, to feed her family well, to keep them healthy and strong. The kitchen was her domain, the market her battlefield. Every shilling spent, every item selected, every meal prepared was an act of love and protection. This responsibility weighed heavily on Victorian mothers because they understood that food was survival, that proper nutrition meant the difference between thriving children and sickly ones, between a husband who could work and one who couldn't. The pressure was immense, and the stakes were life and death. Our London in 1858 was a city transformed beyond recognition. In just 50 years, the population had exploded from 1 million to over 3 million souls packed into streets that couldn't contain them. The old systems of food production had shattered under the weight of demand. No longer could people grow their own vegetables or keep chickens in the yard, or buy directly from farmers they knew and trusted. The city had swallowed the countryside. Food now had to travel from distant counties, had to last for days in carts and warehouses, had to survive handling by multiple sellers before reaching the consumer. There was no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria, no preservation technology beyond salt and smoke. Milk spoiled within hours. Meat rotted in the summer heat. Vegetables wilted and turned to mush. As this created enormous economic pressure on everyone in the food chain. Farmers needed to get produce to market before it spoiled. Wholesalers needed to stretch supplies to meet impossible demand. Retailers needed to make goods look fresh and appealing even when they weren't. Competition was savage. The vendor with the brightest colors won. The baker with the whitest bread took all the customers. The butcher with the reddest meat made the sales. Appearance became everything because customers had no other way to judge quality. You couldn't taste before buying. You couldn't examine ingredients because there were none listed. You made your choices based purely on how things looked and what they cost. This system was perfectly designed for fraud. If brightness sold products, you added chemicals to make things brighter. If whiteness meant quality, you added substances to make things whiter. If customers wanted cheap food and you wanted profit, you stretched real ingredients with worthless or harmful substitutes. The incentives all pointed in one direction, and that direction was adulteration. The problem wasn't new, and it wasn't secret. Back in 1820, a German chemist named Friedrich Occam had published a book that exposed the entire rotten system. A treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons detailed exactly how London's food was being systematically poisoned for profit. Occam named names, identified chemicals, explained the health consequences. The book caused a sensation. It also caused a backlash. Food manufacturers and retailers were furious at being exposed. They harassed Occam, threatened legal action. Friedrich made his life so miserable that he eventually fled back to Germany. His warnings were forgotten. The adulterations continued and actually got worse as the century progressed because the economic pressures only intensified. By 1858, food fraud wasn't an occasional criminal act. It was standard business practice. The Lancet Medical Journal had been running investigations for years, sending inspectors to buy common foods and have them analyzed. The results were horrifying. Nearly every staple item tested contained dangerous adulterants. The investigators published their findings, but nothing changed because there were no laws against any of it. You could put anything in food and sell it to anyone. There were no requirements for labeling, no inspections, no penalties, no accountability whatsoever. Our mother knew none of this as she walked through the market that morning. The streets were thick with coal smoke, and the smell of unwashed humanity pressed together in impossible density. The market stalls created narrow corridors of commerce where vendors shouted their wares and customers jostled for position. Everything was designed to overwhelm the senses, to create urgency, to prevent careful consideration. Colors blazed from every direction. Smells competed for attention. Prices were shouted in a confusing tumult. You had to make quick decisions in this chaos. She carried her basket and her short list of necessities: bread for daily meals, milk for the children, meat for Sunday dinner, perhaps some sweets if there was money left over. She considered herself a careful shopper, someone who examined goods closely and chose wisely. She looked for the freshest appearance, the best value, the most appealing presentation. She thought these standards would protect her family. She believed that by being diligent and selective, she could ensure their safety and health. She was completely wrong. Every standard she used to judge quality was actually leading her toward poison. The brightest colors came from toxic chemicals. The whitest bread contained the most adulterants. The freshest-looking meat had been treated with lead. Her careful shopping was delivering harm directly into her home, and there was absolutely no way for her to know it. The confectioner's stall stopped her in her tracks. The confectioner's stall stopped her in her tracks. It always did. The display was a spectacle of color that seemed almost magical in the gray, smoky air of London. So glass jars lined the shelves in rows, each one filled with sweets and colors that didn't exist in nature: crimson, violet, sunshine yellow, and most striking of all, a green so brilliant and pure it seemed to glow with inner light. The emerald sweets were the most popular, the most requested, the most affordable. Children pressed their faces against the glass and pointed. "The green ones, Mama, please, the green ones." She counted her coins and decided there was enough. A small paper twist of green lozenges wouldn't break the budget, and her daughter had been so good lately, so helpful with the younger ones. The sweets would be a reward, a small brightness in their hard lives. The confectioner weighed out a portion and twisted them into a cone of paper. She tucked them carefully into her basket, already imagining her daughter's face when she saw them. The green color came from a chemical compound called Scheele's green, named after Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the Swedish chemist who invented it in the late 1770s. It was a revolutionary pigment because it produced the most vivid, stable green that had ever been created. Previous green dyes faded quickly or looked muddy and dull. Scheele's green was different. It stayed bright, it didn't deteriorate, and most importantly, it was astonishingly cheap to manufacture. The recipe was simple, just copper and arsenic combined in the right proportions to create copper arsenite. That simplicity and low cost meant it spread everywhere with remarkable speed. By the 1850s, Scheele's green was in wallpaper, fabric, artificial flowers, children's toys, candles, cake decorations, and especially candy. Swiss confectioners loved it because customers demanded bright colors, and this green was the brightest. A tiny amount produced intense color, so the cost per sweet was almost nothing. Nobody seemed concerned about what it was made from. Arsenic was a known poison, certainly, but somehow people convinced themselves that when it was locked into a stable compound and used in small amounts, it became harmless. This belief was completely wrong, but it persisted for decades. Children were eating arsenic every single day, and nobody understood the danger until catastrophe forced the issue. That catastrophe happened in Bradford in October 1858, just months before our mother made her market rounds. William Hardacker ran a sweet shop on Greenside in Bradford. He bought his peppermint humbugs from a local manufacturer named Joseph Neal, who in turn bought his ingredients from a wholesaler. On the night of October 29th, Neal's assistant went to purchase a crucial ingredient called daft, which was actually plaster of Paris used to bulk out the peppermint mixture and increase profit margins. The druggist's shop was closed, so the assistant went to another supplier who gave him what he thought was daft from a barrel in the corner. The substance was actually arsenic trioxide, 12 pounds of pure white arsenic that looked identical to plaster. The assistant mixed it into 240 pounds of sweet mixture and delivered the finished humbugs to Hardacre's shop the next morning. Within hours of the shop opening, people began collapsing. A man named William Ackroyd bought the sweets at 8 in the morning, and by 10 o'clock his children were vomiting violently. Others followed the same pattern with terrifying speed. Children screamed with burning throats. Adults doubled over with convulsions. The symptoms were agonizing, and they came on within minutes of eating the sweets. By the end of that week, 21 people were dead. Over 200 more fell seriously ill. The victims were mostly children who had bought the bright green humbugs as treats. The inquest revealed the terrible mistake, but it also revealed something worse. The plaster of Paris that was supposed to be in the sweets, the daff that confectioners used routinely, was itself often contaminated with arsenic because it was cheaper to produce that way. The Bradford sweets were an extreme case only because someone had grabbed pure arsenic by mistake. The ordinary humbugs contained smaller amounts of arsenic as a routine matter of business. Children had been consuming low doses of poison for years without anyone realizing. The Bradford poisoning became a national scandal. Newspapers demanded action. Doctors testified about the dangers of arsenical compounds in food. The public was horrified. Surely this would end the practice of adding arsenic to candy and other products. But it didn't, at least not immediately. There was still no law against it. Scheele's green remained legal. Confectioners continued using it because customers still wanted those brilliant colors, and competitors who used it could sell sweets more cheaply. The arsenic candy stayed on the shelves. Our mother knew nothing about Bradford as she walked away from the sweet stall. The green lozenges rested in her basket, waiting to be given to her daughter as a treat, as a reward, as a token of maternal love. The baker's stall was her next essential stop. The baker's stall was her next essential stop. Bread was the foundation of every meal, the substance that filled bellies when nothing else could, the basic fuel of Victorian life. Working-class families spent more than half their food budget on bread alone. It appeared at breakfast with butter or drippings, at lunch with cheese, at dinner to soak up gravy and stretch meager portions of meat. Without bread, a family went hungry. The quality of your bread said something about your status and your household management skills. She examined the loaves carefully, looking for the signs of good bread that every housewife had been taught to recognize. The crust should be golden and firm. The interior should be white, not gray or brown. The texture should be light and airy, not dense and heavy. White bread was what respectable families ate. Brown bread was for the poor, for those who couldn't afford better. The whiteness indicated quality, purity, refinement. Or so everyone believed. She selected 2 large loaves that met all her standards. They were beautifully white, perfectly risen, with a pleasant yeasty smell. The baker wrapped them in paper, and she added them to her basket, satisfied that she had chosen well. These loaves would feed her family for days. She had no idea that the whiteness she prized so highly came from a cocktail of chemicals and industrial waste products. The pure wheat flour was expensive, and getting more expensive as demand outstripped supply. Bakers faced a brutal economic reality. They could either raise prices and lose customers to cheaper competitors, or they could stretch the flour with substitutes that maintained appearance while cutting costs. Every baker in London faced this same calculation, and most of them reached the same conclusion. Adulteration wasn't just common, it was necessary to stay in business. The primary additive was alum, a form of aluminum sulfate that served multiple profitable purposes. First, it made bread whiter than pure wheat flour ever could. It bleached away any yellowish tint and created that pristine white color customers associated with quality. Second, it allowed the dough to absorb much more water than normal. See, flour naturally absorbs a certain amount of water during mixing, but alum changed the chemistry and permitted absorption of far greater quantities. This meant that a pound of flour could yield significantly more bread when alum was added. The baker bought flour by weight and sold bread by weight, so anything that increased the final weight without adding ingredient cost went straight to profit. The amount of alum used was substantial. Analysis by investigators from The Lancet in the 1850s found that commercial bread commonly contained between 2 and 6% alum by weight. That might not sound like much, but consider that a family eating 2 pounds of bread daily was consuming up to 2 ounces of pure aluminum compound every week. This accumulated in the body because human beings had no mechanism to efficiently eliminate aluminum. It built up in tissues, in organs, in bones. The health effects were insidious because they developed slowly. Alum interfered with digestion by neutralizing stomach acid. It caused chronic constipation and cramping. It blocked the absorption of nutrients from food, meaning that people could eat adequate amounts but still suffer from malnutrition because their bodies couldn't extract what they needed. Over time, aluminum accumulated in the brain and nervous system, contributing to cognitive problems and neurological decline. Victorian doctors noted an epidemic of digestive complaints and put it down to the stresses of modern life. They never connected it to the bread everyone was eating 3 times a day. But alum wasn't the only additive bakers employed. Chalk, which is calcium carbonate, was ground into fine powder and mixed into flour to add bulk and weight at minimal cost. Chalk had the advantage of being completely white, so it didn't discolor the bread. It also had the disadvantage of being essentially indigestible. It passed through the digestive system like sand, irritating tissues and contributing nothing nutritional. Some bakers used ground bones from slaughterhouses, burned and powdered into bone ash. This added weight and a slight nutritional value in the form of calcium, but it also frequently introduced lead contamination because the burning process concentrated any lead the animals had accumulated during their lives. Plaster of Paris, which is calcium sulfate, served a similar function to alum in that it allowed greater water absorption and added weight. It gave bread a particular smooth texture that some customers found appealing. Like chalk, it was largely indigestible and caused intestinal problems with regular consumption. The most desperate bakers used sawdust when they could grind it fine enough to avoid detection. Others used ground beans or peas that had been dried and powdered, which at least had some nutritional content even if they weren't wheat. The Lancet conducted extensive investigations into bread adulteration throughout the 1850s. They hired inspectors to purchase bread from bakeries across London, from the cheapest shops in poor neighborhoods to expensive establishments in wealthy areas. Every single sample was then subjected to chemical analysis. The results were damning. They found that roughly 70% of all bread sold in London contained alum. The percentage was even higher among cheaper loaves, but even premium expensive bread frequently tested positive. Chalk and bone ash appeared in about 40% of samples. Plaster showed up in perhaps 20%. When the Lancet published these findings, the baking industry responded with fury. They claimed the testing was flawed, that the amounts were trivial, that these substances were harmless. Some bakers argued that alum actually improved bread and made it more digestible, a claim that had no scientific basis whatsoever, but sounded plausible to consumers who didn't understand chemistry. The industry lobbied hard against any proposed regulations, insisting that interference with their business practices would drive up costs and hurt the poor who depended on cheap bread. So this argument had teeth because it contained a grain of truth. Poor families were already spending devastating portions of their income on food. A loaf of bread cost perhaps 3 pence. If regulations forced bakers to use pure flour and eliminated adulterants, that price might rise to 4 or even 5 pence. For a family already on the edge of starvation, that difference mattered enormously. The bakers positioned themselves as champions of the poor, providing affordable nutrition, while the reformers pushing for pure food laws were cast as wealthy elitists who didn't understand economic reality. The reformers countered that poisoning people slowly with chemical additives wasn't actually helping them, and that proper nutrition from pure food would improve health outcomes enough to offset the cost. But this was a harder argument to make because the effects of adulteration were invisible and long-term, while hunger was immediate and obvious. A mother watching her children go to bed with empty stomachs didn't care much about abstract concerns over aluminum accumulation. She needed bread she could afford right now today. This tension between cost and safety would plague food regulation efforts for decades. Even bakers who wanted to produce pure bread found themselves unable to compete. If your competitor was selling loaves for 3 pence because his contained 50% adulterants while your pure loaves had to sell for 5 pence, customers went elsewhere. The market rewarded fraud and punished honesty. Individual virtue couldn't solve a systemic problem. Only regulation could level the playing field. But regulation faced fierce resistance from the industry and skepticism from consumers worried about price increases. Our mother understood none of this complexity as she carried her loaves home. She believed she had made good choices, that the white color proved quality, that feeding her family this bread was an act of proper household management. The Victorian ideal of the angel in the house, the woman who created domestic perfection through careful attention and moral virtue, told her that she was succeeding. The bread looked right, smelled right, cost what bread should cost. By every standard available to her, she had shopped well. Though the fact that she was bringing home ground bones and industrial chemicals hidden inside innocent-looking loaves was invisible to her and would remain invisible until the damage was already done to the bodies of everyone she fed. The milk seller operated from a cart with large metal cans, each one supposedly filled with fresh milk brought in from dairies outside the city that morning. The milk seller operated from a cart with large metal cans, each one supposedly filled with fresh milk brought in from dairies outside the city that morning. The milk looked perfect, thick and white, with a cream line visible at the top of the jug when the seller tilted it for inspection. This appearance of richness and purity was exactly what she needed. Milk was essential for children's health, for their growth and strength. She needed it for morning porridge, for tea, for the baby who was still nursing but needed supplementation. She handed over her coins and held out her jug to be filled. What poured into her container was nowhere near pure milk. The adulteration of milk was perhaps the most widespread and deadly food fraud in Victorian London, because milk spoiled so quickly and traveled so poorly and was consumed primarily by the most vulnerable members of society, infants and young children. The economic incentives for fraud were overwhelming, and the opportunities for harm were enormous. The most basic adulteration was simple watering down. Milk was commonly diluted by 30 to 50%, with added water to increase volume and profit. A dairy farmer or milk seller could buy or produce 10 gallons of milk and sell 15 gallons by adding water. The markup was pure profit since water cost essentially nothing. But this wasn't clean water from a pure source. London's water supply in 1858 was notoriously contaminated. Most of the city still drew water from the Thames, which was essentially an open sewer carrying waste from millions of people. The Great Stink would happen this very year when the smell became so overwhelming that Parliament had to suspend sessions. Private wells were hardly better since they were often located near cesspits that leaked sewage directly into the groundwater. Adding this contaminated water to milk meant adding cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and countless other waterborne diseases directly to the food supply. Infants drinking this milk were consuming pathogens their immune systems couldn't fight. So the death rate among bottle-fed babies was catastrophically higher than among breastfed babies. But this was attributed to the general weakness of infants rather than to poisoned milk. Watering down created another problem because diluted milk looked thin and watery rather than rich and creamy. Customers could see the difference and wouldn't pay full price for obviously adulterated milk, so the sellers had to disguise the dilution by adding substances that restored body and color. Chalk dust was ground into fine powder and stirred in to create artificial thickness and whiteness. Plaster of Paris served the same function. Some milk sellers used crushed limestone or even ground bones. All of these were essentially indigestible and served only to make watered milk look genuine. Even more disturbing were reports of sellers adding brain matter from slaughtered calves to increase the creamy appearance and protein content. This practice was documented in investigations, though how widespread it was remains unclear. What is certain is that milk sellers would add virtually anything that made their product look richer without obvious cost. The color of badly watered or spoiled milk often turned grayish or developed a blue tint. To counteract this, sellers added colorants. Chalk helped with whiteness, but sometimes stronger chemicals were needed. Lead-based white paints were sometimes mixed in to restore the pure white color customers expected. This introduced yet another toxic metal into the food supply, accumulating in children's bodies and causing neurological damage. But the worst milk scandal was swill milk, produced by urban dairies that kept cows in basement stalls next to distilleries. These operations fed the cows exclusively on distillery waste, the hot fermented grain mash left over from alcohol production. This diet was completely unnatural for cattle and devastated their health. The cows were kept in darkness, often standing in their own waste, never seeing pasture or eating grass. They developed infections and ulcers. Many went partially blind. They produced milk that was thin, blue-tinted, and reeked of the distillery waste. Swill milk was particularly associated with infant mortality. Babies fed on this milk developed chronic diarrhea, failed to gain weight, and died at shocking rates. In neighborhoods where swill milk predominated, infant mortality could reach 50%. The milk was so deficient in nutrients and so contaminated with bacteria that it essentially poisoned babies while seeming to feed them. Investigations exposed these dairies repeatedly throughout the 1850s, but they continued operating because they were profitable and because there were no laws to shut them down. By 1882, systematic testing would reveal that 1 in 5 milk samples purchased in London markets was seriously adulterated or contaminated. That figure likely represented improvement over the 1850s when regulation was non-existent. Our mother had no way to test what she was buying. The milk looked right, and that was all she could judge by. She tucked her filled jug carefully into her basket, protecting it from spilling, planning the meals where it would nourish her children. The liquid she carried home was sewage water thickened with chalk and possibly colored with lead, a poison that looked like food. The butcher's stall was her pride, the place where she could demonstrate that her household was doing well enough to afford meat. The butcher's stall was her pride, the place where she could demonstrate that her household was doing well enough to afford meat. Not every family managed meat regularly. Many survived on bread and potatoes with only occasional scraps of bacon or cheap cuts boiled into soup. But she had budgeted carefully, and Sunday dinner would feature a proper joint of beef, something the family could gather around, something that signified respectability and success. The display looked magnificent. The cuts of meat were deep red, glistening with fat, or laid out on marble slabs in arrangements that suggested abundance and freshness. She examined the beef carefully, looking for the characteristics of quality. The color should be bright red, not pale or grayish. The fat should be white and firm. The surface should look moist but not slimy. The smell should be clean and slightly metallic, the smell of fresh blood, not sweet or sour, which would indicate spoilage. The joint she selected met all these standards. The butcher wrapped it in paper and handed it over. She placed it carefully in her basket, already planning the meal, imagining her family's satisfaction. What she didn't know was that the meat had been rotting 3 days earlier. In an era without refrigeration, meat spoiled within hours during warm weather. Butchers faced constant losses as their stock turned bad before they could sell it. Throwing away spoiled meat meant losing all the money invested in purchasing it from the slaughterhouse. The economic pressure to salvage rotting inventory was intense, so butchers developed techniques to make spoiled meat appear fresh for long enough to complete a sale. The primary method was painting the surface with red lead, also called lead oxide. This bright red powder mixed with a bit of fat or oil created a paint that could be brushed onto the gray-brown surface of spoiled meat, instantly restoring the deep red color of freshness. The transformation was remarkable. Meat that looked obviously rotten could be made to appear freshly butchered with just a thin coating of lead compound. Some butchers used vermilion instead, which is mercury sulfide. Now, it produced an even more vivid red, but was considerably more expensive, so lead remained the standard choice for most operations. After painting the surface, butchers sealed it with a coating of fat to hide the chemical smell and prevent further visible deterioration. They used rancid pork fat or bone marrow, substances that were themselves spoiled but created a glistening appearance customers associated with quality. This coating masked the sweet, rotten smell of decaying meat for several hours, long enough to get it sold and into someone's kitchen. By the time the customer discovered the problem at home, the transaction was complete and there was no recourse. The health effects of eating lead-painted meat were severe. Lead is a cumulative poison, meaning the body cannot effectively eliminate it. It accumulates in bones and organs over time. In adults, chronic lead exposure caused fatigue, digestive problems, joint pain, and cognitive decline. In children, the effects were devastating. Lead interfered with brain development, causing learning difficulties, behavioral problems, and reduced intelligence. It damaged the nervous system permanently. Pregnant women exposed to lead faced higher rates of miscarriage and stillbirth. Their babies were born with lead already in their systems, starting life poisoned. Mercury from vermilion treated meat caused its own catalog of horrors. It damaged the kidneys and caused neurological problems, including tremors, personality changes, and sensory disturbances. The phrase mad as a hatter came from hat makers who worked with mercury compounds and developed mental disturbances from chronic exposure. Eating mercury-painted meat delivered the poison directly into the digestive system where it was efficiently absorbed. Investigations in the 1850s suggested that somewhere between 30 and 40% of meat sold in London markets showed evidence of chemical treatment or advanced spoilage that had been disguised. The problem was worse in summer when meat spoiled faster and worse in poor neighborhoods where customers had less power to complain. Our mother wrapped her lead-painted joint carefully in paper, protecting her investment, anticipating the family meal that would center around it. She was bringing home rotting flesh disguised as food, painted with poison, sealed with rancid fat. Sunday dinner would be a toxic event presented as a celebration. Her final stop was the pickle and preserve merchant. Here, a stall piled high with jars of colorful preserved vegetables and fruits intended to brighten winter meals. Her final stop was the pickle and preserve merchant, a stall piled high with jars of colorful preserved vegetables and fruits intended to brighten winter meals when fresh produce became scarce and expensive. She didn't need pickles, strictly speaking, they weren't essential the way bread and milk were, but she had a few pence left and wanted something special for Sunday dinner. Something that would show her family that she managed the household well, that she could provide not just sustenance but small luxuries that made meals more enjoyable. The pickled cucumbers caught her eye immediately. They glowed with an almost unnatural brilliance. Now, a green so vivid and electric, it seemed to pulse with color, even in the dim, smoky light of the market. That green signified freshness and quality in her mind. Everyone knew that freshly pickled cucumbers should be bright green. The dull olive-brown color meant old stock, vegetables that had been sitting too long, inferior goods. She wanted the best for her family, so she chose a jar of the brightest ones available. The merchant wrapped the jar and took her money. She arranged it carefully in her basket among the other purchases. The shopping was complete. She had everything needed for several days of good meals. She felt satisfied with her choices, confident that she had shopped intelligently and well, that her family would be properly nourished and cared for. The bright green pickles would be the jewel of Sunday dinner, a proof of her competence and care. Those pickles had been soaked in copper sulfate solution to achieve that extraordinary color. Naturally, pickled cucumbers turned a drab olive green or brownish hue as the vinegar and salt broke down the chlorophyll in the vegetables. This natural color was completely unappealing to Victorian consumers who had learned to associate brightness with freshness. Market research of the time showed that customers simply would not buy naturally colored pickles even when they were genuinely fresh. The color repelled them and suggested spoilage even when no spoilage existed. Merchants faced a choice between selling authentic products that nobody wanted or treating their goods with chemicals that produced the colors customers demanded. The economic decision was obvious. Copper sulfate was cheap, readily available, and produced spectacular results. Cucumbers, green beans, peas, any green vegetable could be transformed into a brilliant jewel tone by soaking in a copper sulfate bath. The treatment took only a few hours and the color remained stable for months. Copper sulfate is highly toxic. Acute exposure causes violent nausea and vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and a metallic taste in the mouth. These symptoms could appear within hours of consumption. Chronic exposure from eating treated vegetables regularly caused much more serious damage. Copper accumulated in the liver and kidneys, causing progressive organ damage that developed silently over months or years. It interfered with the production of red blood cells, leading to anemia. It caused neurological problems including tremors, difficulty walking, and personality changes. High levels could cause seizures and death. The copper sulfate treatment wasn't limited to pickled vegetables. It was used on any preserved food where green color mattered. Canned peas were treated to maintain their bright color. Dried herbs were dipped in copper solutions before being packaged and sold. Even fresh vegetables were sometimes sprayed with copper compounds to make them appear fresher and more appealing at market. The Victorian consumer was ingesting copper from multiple sources without any awareness of the cumulative exposure. Other toxic colorants were deployed across the preserved food industry with equal abandon. Mustard was colored bright yellow, with lead chromate because natural mustard had a duller brownish yellow that consumers found unappetizing. Lead chromate was also added to turmeric and curry powder to intensify their yellow color. Gloucester cheese got its distinctive orange-red hue from red lead. Tea leaves were sometimes colored with Prussian blue, which is a cyanide compound, to make cheap tea look like expensive varieties. Mercury compounds appeared in canned goods because the canning process itself was poorly understood and frequently went wrong. When canned food spoiled inside the sealed container, some manufacturers simply opened the cans, treated the contents with mercury-based preservatives to kill bacteria and mask decay, then resealed them for sale. The consumer had no way to know that the can they opened contained food that had already spoiled once and been chemically resuscitated. Where the emerging technology of canning created its own dangers beyond intentional adulteration. Botulism poisoning from improperly processed canned goods was common but not yet understood as a specific disease. People died from what seemed like random food poisoning, never connecting it to the cans they had opened days earlier. Lead solder used to seal cans leached into acidic foods like tomatoes and fruit, adding yet another source of lead exposure to Victorian diets. Our mother tucked the jar of glowing green pickles into her basket alongside the arsenic candy, the alum bread, the sewage milk, and the lead-painted meat. Her shopping expedition was complete. She had acquired everything necessary to feed her family for the coming days. She turned toward home, satisfied with her morning's work, completely unaware that every item she carried was a different method of poisoning the people she loved most. She walked home through the crowded streets, feeling the weight of the basket on her arm and the satisfaction of a job well done. She walked home through the crowded streets, feeling the weight of the basket on her arm and the satisfaction of a job well done. Shopping was exhausting work, navigating the crowds and the noise, making careful decisions with limited money, carrying everything back through the chaos. But she had managed it successfully. The basket was full of good food purchased at reasonable prices. Her family would eat well. She had fulfilled her duty as wife and mother, as the angel of the house whose sacred responsibility was nourishing and protecting her loved ones. At home, she unpacked everything carefully, storing items in the larder and planning the meals ahead. The routine of Victorian domestic life revolved around these rhythms of shopping and cooking, of transforming raw ingredients into sustenance. She felt pride in her competence, in her ability to stretch the household budget while maintaining standards. This was what good housekeeping looked like. Breakfast the next morning featured sliced bread with butter and milky porridge for the children. The alum bread caused subtle digestive discomfort that nobody recognized as abnormal because stomach complaints were simply part of daily life. The aluminum compounds interfered with nutrient absorption, meaning the children were eating but not fully benefiting from what they consumed. The milk poured over the porridge carried sewage bacteria and chalk dust, adding pathogens and indigestible material to their small bodies. Her husband drank tea lightened with the same contaminated milk before heading to work. The meal looked wholesome and normal, exactly what a proper Victorian breakfast should be. Lunch was simpler, just bread and cheese with water to drink. Afterward, she gave the children their treat, the green lozenges she had bought as a reward for good behavior. They sucked on the sweets with delight, the arsenic dissolving slowly on their tongues and being absorbed through the delicate membranes of their mouths. The dose wasn't enough to cause immediate dramatic symptoms, but it entered their bloodstreams and began accumulating in their organs. With regular exposure over months and years, this arsenic would interfere with their development, damage their nervous systems, which increased their susceptibility to disease. Sunday dinner was the centerpiece of the week, the meal that demonstrated the household status and the mother's skill. She roasted the beef joint carefully, basting it with its own fat, filling the house with rich, meaty smells that signified abundance. The lead paint on the surface cooked into the meat, the lead oxide breaking down in the heat and permeating the flesh. She served thick slices to her family alongside the bright green pickles that she arranged artfully on the plate. The copper from the pickles mixed with the lead from the meat in their digestive systems. Two different toxic metals working their slow damage simultaneously. The family ate together in the parlor, the Victorian ideal of domestic harmony made real. The father complimented the meal, the children cleaned their plates. The mother watched with deep satisfaction, believing she had created something good and nourishing, that she had succeeded in her most important role. None of them felt immediate illness because the poisoning was gradual and cumulative. The symptoms would develop slowly, chronic problems that seemed like ordinary Victorian poor health rather than systematic poisoning. Over the following weeks and months, the children would struggle with learning and concentration. They would be pale and weak, prone to illness, slower to develop than they should be. The baby would fail to thrive despite being fed regularly. The father would experience increasing fatigue and mental fog that he attributed to the demands of work. The mother herself would suffer digestive problems and headaches. But none of this would be traced to food because everyone around them experienced similar symptoms. This was simply what life felt like in Victorian London. The poisoning was invisible and universal. An entire generation of children grew up neurologically damaged by lead, developmentally stunted by contaminated milk, chronically weakened by adulterated food. The effects rippled through society in ways that were impossible to measure because there was no baseline of health to compare against. Everyone was exposed, so everyone suffered, and the suffering seemed normal. The mother had done everything right according to the standards of her time. She had shopped carefully, chosen quality goods, prepared meals with love and skill. The system had turned her maternal devotion into a delivery mechanism for poison. This mother's story was not unique or unusual. This mother's story was not unique or unusual. It was replicated in millions of Victorian homes every single day across Britain. For decades, systematic food fraud was simply accepted as the cost of industrial progress and urban growth. Caveat emptor, buyer beware, the market will sort itself out. It took catastrophes like the Bradford arsenic poisoning and relentless campaigning by medical reformers to force any change at all. The 1860 Food Adulteration Act was passed, but it had no enforcement mechanism and changed almost nothing. Real regulation didn't arrive until the 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act, and even then enforcement remained weak for years. The Victorian food industry had weaponized maternal love itself, turning the most intimate act of care into a vector for harm. The mother believed she was protecting her family. The system ensured she was slowly killing them. If this Victorian nightmare fascinates you, subscribe for more hidden histories. Sonnet 4.5. Claude é uma IA pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.